When you look at social media through the lens of an empath, you're not just looking at a tool for connection, you're looking at an environment saturated with emotional signals. Every post carries intent. Every comment carries tone. Every image carries an unspoken comparison. And while most people can scroll through that stream and remain relatively unaffected, an empath doesn't have that luxury. They don't just observe emotional content, they absorb it. This is where the concept of emotional self-protection begins to take shape. For an empath, exposure is not neutral. It comes at a cost. Psychologically, what's happening here is a form of heightened sensory processing, not in the physical sense, but in the emotional domain. The brain is constantly scanning, interpreting, and internalizing the emotional states of others. On social media, that process doesn't pause. It accelerates. Think about the average feed. Within seconds, you can encounter outrage, insecurity, celebration, envy, grief, and validation-seeking behavior all compressed into a single scroll. For most people, this is just noise. For an empath, it's input. And too much input without adequate filtering leads to overstimulation. This is not weakness, it's a different calibration of awareness. Over time, this creates a predictable pattern. The empath begins to associate social media not with connection, but with depletion. They may not consciously articulate it at first, but the body keeps track. Increased mental fatigue, subtle anxiety, a sense of emotional heaviness after scrolling, these are signals. And empaths, perhaps more than anyone, are attuned to those signals. So what do? They adapt. Instead of increasing their presence, they reduce it. Instead of sharing more, they become selective. And eventually, many choose to step back almost entirely. From the outside, this can be misinterpreted. People assume disinterest, insecurity, or even social withdrawal. But the reality is far more calculated. This is not avoidance, it's regulation. There's also a deeper philosophical layer to this. Social media operates on a principle of constant exposure. Visibility is currency. The more you show, the more you're seen. But for an empath, visibility without boundaries feels like vulnerability without control. And when you are naturally receptive to emotional input, uncontrolled exposure becomes unsustainable. So they begin to draw a line. They start asking questions that most people never consider. What am I taking in right now? How is this affecting my internal state? Is this interaction nourishing or is it draining? These are not casual reflections. These are protective mechanisms. And over time, they lead to a very intentional form of disengagement. It's important to understand that this isn't about rejecting connection. Empaths value connection deeply, arguably more than most. But they seek it in environments where emotional exchange is mutual, grounded, and real. Social media in its current form often lacks those qualities. It amplifies extremes. It rewards performance. It compresses complex human experiences into digestible fragments. And for someone who processes emotion deeply, that compression can feel disorienting. There's also the issue of emotional contagion. Research in psychology shows that emotions can spread through networks, even digital ones. You don't have to interact directly with someone to be affected by their emotional state. Exposure alone is enough. For an empath, this effect is magnified. They don't just recognize the emotion, they resonate with it. Now imagine being consistently exposed to thousands of emotional signals, many of which are unfiltered, exaggerated, or unresolved. At a certain point, the system reaches capacity. And when that happens, the most rational response is not to push through, it's to pull back. This is where self-protection becomes a conscious strategy. The empath begins to curate not just what they consume, but how often they engage. They limit their exposure, not out of fear, but out of awareness. They understand that their clarity depends on what they allow into their minds. And in a space where control over incoming information is limited, the most effective boundary is absence. What's interesting is that this withdrawal often leads to a deeper form of presence elsewhere. When empaths step away from constant digital exposure, they tend to become more grounded in their immediate environment. Their conversations become more intentional. Their relationships become more focused. Their inner world becomes quieter and therefore more precise. So the silence you see on social media is not emptiness, it's filtration. It's a deliberate refusal to participate in an environment that compromises emotional stability. And in many ways, it's a form of discipline. because it takes discipline to step away from something designed to keep you engaged. It takes awareness to recognize when connection becomes consumption, and it takes strength to choose clarity over constant visibility. And this leads to a simple but powerful realization. Not everything that connects you is good for you. Sometimes the most intelligent move is not to engage more, but to engage less with intention. Because in a world that rewards constant exposure, the empath understands something most people overlook: protecting your mind is more important than proving your presence. If you continue following this pattern, something else begins to surface, something less about protection and more about principle. It's not just that empaths feel overwhelmed by the environment, it's that they fundamentally don't align with what that environment rewards. And that brings us to a deeper tension: the conflict between authenticity and performance. Most social platforms operate on a simple, unspoken rule: visibility increases when identity becomes curated. The more polished, dramatic, or strategically presented you are, the more attention you receive. Over time, this creates a subtle pressure to perform rather than to express. People don't just share their lives, they edit them, package them, and present them in ways that are designed to be consumed. Now, for the average user, this becomes normalized. It's just how the system works. But for an empath, this dynamic feels inherently unstable. There's a psychological friction that emerges when what you present externally doesn't fully match what you experience internally. And empaths are particularly sensitive to that misalignment, not just in others, but in themselves. They can sense when something is off. When they consider posting, it's rarely a casual decision. There's an internal evaluation that happens, often in the background. Is this real? Is this an accurate reflection of my state? Or am I shaping this to be received a certain way? And if the answer leans toward performance, even slightly, it creates discomfort. This discomfort is rooted in something important, what psychologists might describe as self-concept integrity. It's the alignment between who you are internally and how you present yourself externally. When that alignment is strong, there's a sense of coherence. When it's disrupted, even in small ways, it creates tension. For empaths, that tension is amplified. They don't easily compartmentalize. They don't switch between real self and online self without noticing the shift. So when social media implicitly asks they to exaggerate, filter, or selectively present their lives, it feels less like participation and more like distortion. And here's where most people misunderstand the silence. They assume empaths are holding back because they lack confidence or because they don't want attention. But in many cases, it's the opposite. It's not a lack of identity, it's a refusal to dilute it. They are not avoiding visibility, they are avoiding inauthentic visibility. There's also a philosophical dimension to this. When identity becomes something you construct for an audience, it starts to shift your relationship with yourself. You begin to think in terms of perception rather than truth. How will this be seen? Replaces, is this accurate? And over time, that shift can subtly reshape behavior. Empaths are highly resistant to that shift. They place a premium on internal truth. Not because it's easy, but because it's stable. It doesn't fluctuate with feedback. It doesn't depend on approval. And in a digital environment where feedback is immediate and constant, maintaining that internal anchor becomes increasingly difficult. So instead of adapting to the system, many empaths opt out of its more performative aspects. They might still observe. They might still engage occasionally. But they resist the urge to construct a version of themselves that exists primarily for consumption, because they understand something that often goes unnoticed. Once you start performing consistently, it becomes harder to stop. The audience begins to expect continuity, and you begin to feel obligated to maintain it. At that point, expression turns into maintenance, and maintenance requires energy. For an empath whose energy is already being managed carefully, this becomes an inefficient investment. Why allocate emotional and cognitive resources to sustain an image that doesn't fully represent you? Why participate in a system that rewards exaggeration when your natural inclination is toward precision? So they step back not out of disinterest, but out of alignment. They choose to express themselves in environments where authenticity is not penalized. Conversations that are slower, deeper, and less performative. Relationships where presence matters more than presentation. Spaces where they don't have to translate their experience into something easily digestible. And when they do choose to share, it's often measured, intentional. There's a clarity behind it. It's not driven by the need to be seen, but by the desire to communicate something real. And if that means posting less or not at all, they're comfortable with that trade-off. Because for them, the cost of inauthenticity is higher than the benefit of visibility. This is where the broader insight emerges. In a system that rewards performance, authenticity becomes a form of resistance. It requires you to tolerate being less visible, less validated, and sometimes less understood. But it also preserves something essential: your sense of coherence. And without that coherence, no amount of external recognition is sustainable. So when you see an empath who isn't actively presenting themselves online, it's worth reconsidering the assumption. They're not disengaged. They're selective. They're not absent. They're aligned. And alignment in this context is not passive, it's deliberate. Because at some point, you have to decide whether you're shaping your identity to fit the platform or choosing your level of presence based on who you actually are. And that decision carries weight, because the moment you prioritize being seen over being real, you start negotiating with your own integrity. And once that negotiation becomes a habit, it's very difficult to reverse. So the question isn't whether you should show up more. The question is whether the version of you that shows up is one you can stand behind when no one is watching. If you follow this pattern a little further, you start to notice something that isn't immediately obvious on the surface. It's not just that empaths are protecting their energy, and it's not just that they resist performing a curated identity. There's also a deeper disengagement from the very currency that drives these platforms' validation. For most people, social media runs on a feedback loop. You post something, you receive likes, comments, shares, and your brain registers that as a form of reward. Neurologically, this ties into dopamine-driven reinforcement. The more engagement you receive, the more likely you are to repeat the behavior. Over time, this creates a subtle dependency. Not always extreme, not always conscious, but consistent enough to shape how people present themselves. Now, here's where the empath diverges. Empaths are not immune to validation, but they process it differently. Surface-level feedback, likes, quick comments, passive engagement doesn't carry the same psychological weight for them. It doesn't register as deeply meaningful. In fact, in many cases, it feels incomplete. There's a sense that something is missing, and that something is depth. Empaths are wired for emotional nuance. They're drawn to conversations that have layers, to interactions where there's a genuine exchange of perspective, feeling, and understanding. A single tap on a screen doesn't provide that. A short comment rarely captures it. So while the platform is designed to deliver rapid, frequent signals of approval, those signals don't fully satisfy the empath's need for connection. This creates a kind of psychological mismatch. On one side, you have a system that rewards quantity, more posts, more reactions, more visibility. On the other side, you have an individual who values quality, fewer interactions, but with more substance. And when those two don't align, engagement starts to feel transactional. You begin to see it for what it is. A like becomes less of a connection and more of a gesture. A comment becomes less of a conversation and more of a response. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with that, it doesn't fulfill the empath's internal criteria for meaningful interaction. So instead of feeling energized by engagement, they often feel neutral or even slightly empty. That's an important point because it contradicts a common assumption. People tend to believe that if someone isn't actively seeking validation online, it must be because they lack confidence or visibility. But in the case of an empath, it's often the opposite. They're not avoiding validation because they can't get it, they're disengaging from it because it doesn't meet their standard. They're not looking for more attention. They're looking for something real. And when that's not available in the format being offered, they don't try to force it. They withdraw. There's also a secondary effect that develops over time. As empaths observe the patterns of engagement on social media, they start to recognize how behavior is shaped by the pursuit of validation. They see how people adjust their tone, their opinions, even their experiences to maximize response. And because empaths are highly perceptive, they don't just see the behavior, they understand the motivation behind it. This awareness changes how they relate to the entire system. They begin to question the authenticity of what they're seeing, not in a cynical way, but in a precise way. They can distinguish between expression and performance, between sharing and signaling. And once you see that clearly, it becomes difficult to engage in the same way without feeling a disconnect, because now you're aware of the mechanism. You know that what's being rewarded isn't always what's most truthful, it's what's most engaging. And engagement, by its nature, tends to favor extremes. Strong opinions, heightened AMO, simplified narratives. Subtlety doesn't travel as far. Complexity doesn't spread as quickly. But empaths operate in subtlety. They think in layers. They process contradictions. They're comfortable with complexity. So when they try to compress that into a format that rewards simplicity and speed, it feels like a reduction of their actual experience. And again, this brings us back to a choice. Do you adapt your communication to fit the system, or do you preserve the integrity of your expression and accept reduced visibility? Empaths tend to choose the second option, not because it's easier, but because it's consistent with how they experience the world. They would rather have one conversation that matters than 100 interactions that don't. They would rather be understood by a few than acknowledged by many. This is why their presence often shifts away from public platforms and toward more private, controlled environments. Direct conversations, smaller circles, spaces where engagement is slower but more intentional, where feedback isn't instantaneous but it's meaningful. And in those spaces they tend to thrive because the interaction matches their internal framework. There's also a long-term psychological benefit to this. When you're not relying on external signals to validate your expression, your sense of self becomes more stable. It's not fluctuating based on how something is received. It's grounded in how accurately it reflects your internal state. That stability is valuable. It reduces the need for constant feedback. It allows for more independent thinking. It creates a buffer between your identity and the reactions of others. And in an environment where feedback is immediate and often unpredictable, that buffer becomes a form of resilience. So when an empath steps back from the validation cycle of social media, it's not a rejection of connection, it's a refinement of it. They're not disconnecting from people. They're disconnecting from shallow feedback loops that don't serve them. And in doing so, they're making a very specific trade-off. Less visibility, but more meaning. Fewer interactions, but greater. Depth. Less noise, but more clarity. And if you really think about it, that trade-off reveals something fundamental. Not all validation is equal. Some of it amplifies your presence, and some of it actually diminishes your sense of self. The challenge is knowing the difference and having the discipline to choose accordingly. Because at the end of the day, the question isn't how many people acknowledge you. It's whether the acknowledgement you receive actually reflects who you are. And if you bring all of this together, the overstimulation, the resistance to performance, the rejection of shallow validation, you arrive at something even more fundamental. At a certain point, it stops being about preference and starts becoming about capacity. Specifically, the capacity to manage energy in a way that keeps your internal system stable. Because for an empath, energy is not an abstract concept. It's measurable through experience. You feel when it's high, when it's depleted, when it's scattered. Unlike most people, you can often trace that shift back to specific inputs, conversations, environments, even digital interactions. This is where boundary awareness becomes critical. Most people think of boundaries in physical or social terms: what you say yes to, what you say no to, who you allow into your life. But for an empath, boundaries extend into the psychological space. What you allow into your attention is just as important as who you allow into your presence. And social media complicates this because it bypasses traditional boundaries. You don't have to invite someone into your space for their emotions to reach you. You don't have to engage in a conversation to be affected by its tone. Exposure alone is enough. And when that exposure is constant, it creates a steady drain on your cognitive and emotional resources. Now, here's the part that often goes unnoticed. That drain is cumulative. It's not always immediate or obvious. You don't scroll for 5 minutes and suddenly feel exhausted. It builds gradually. A little tension here, a slight shift in mood there, a sense of distraction that lingers longer than it should. Over time, these small increments add up, and eventually you reach a point where your baseline state is no longer clear. You feel scattered, and when your internal state is scattered, Your ability to think, decide, and respond with precision starts to decline. Empaths are particularly sensitive to this shift. They notice when their clarity drops, they recognize when their emotional state is being influenced by something external. And because they rely heavily on that clarity to navigate the world, they don't ignore the signal. They adjust. This is where energy preservation becomes a deliberate strategy, not just a passive reaction. It's not about avoiding the world, it's about managing your interaction with it in a way that maintains stability. And one of the most effective ways to do that is through controlled disengagement, not complete isolation, not withdrawal from all forms of interaction, but a selective reduction in exposure to inputs that don't contribute to your mental clarity. Social media, in many cases, falls into that category. So the empath begins to regulate their presence. They spend less time scrolling. They become more intentional about what they consume. They limit their participation in environments that are emotionally chaotic or cognitively fragmented. And importantly, they give themselves permission to step away without explanation. Because here's the reality: most people don't question constant engagement. They question absence. If you're always present, always responding, always visible, no one asks why. But the moment you step back, it draws attention. People interpret it. They assign meaning to it. And often that interpretation is inaccurate. They assume disconnection when in fact it's discipline. They assume withdrawal when in fact it's regulation. But the empath doesn't operate based on those external interpretations. They operate based on internal feedback. And when that feedback indicates overload, they act accordingly. There's also a deeper philosophical shift that happens here. You begin to realize that your attention is a finite resource. Every moment you spend engaging with something is a moment you're not allocating elsewhere. And when your attention is consistently directed toward fragmented, low-depth inputs, it affects the quality of your thinking. You lose continuity. You lose the ability to stay with an idea long enough to fully develop it. You lose the space required for reflection. And for an empath whose strength often lies in depth of processing, that loss is significant. So they start protecting not just their emotions, but their attention. They create space to think, to feel, to recalibrate without interference. Space to engage with the world on their own terms, rather than reacting to a constant stream of external stimuli. And in that space, something important happens. Their internal signal becomes clearer. They can distinguish what they actually think from what they've absorbed. They can separate their own emotional state from the emotions they've encountered, and that separation is what allows them to function effectively. Without it, everything blends together. And when everything blends together, you lose precision. So the decision to limit social media presence is not about rejecting modern tools or avoiding interaction. It's about maintaining a level of internal order that allows for accurate perception and intentional action. It's about understanding that not all access is beneficial and not all engagement is productive. And more importantly, it's about recognizing that your energy, once depleted, is not instantly recoverable. It requires time. It requires distance. It requires an environment that supports restoration rather than stimulation. So the empath builds that environment, often quietly, often without explanation. They choose when to engage. They choose when to withdraw. And they do so based on a principle that most people overlook: sustainability. Because it's not about how much you can handle in the moment. It's about how consistently you can function over time without compromising your clarity. And once you understand that, the behavior starts to make sense. The reduced presence, the selective engagement, the intentional silence, it's all part of a system designed to preserve what matters most: not attention, not visibility, but stability, because without stability, none of the other elements, connection, expression, understanding, can be maintained. And that leads to a final critical point. If you don't actively manage what you allow into your mind, something else will do it for you, and it won't prioritize your clarity. So the question becomes very simple: are you choosing your inputs, or are your inputs choosing you?